I think just some random thoughts that have been generated in my brain, and I'm sure you have many, many more in your thoughts as well. As Jane said about me, I'm a historian, and so part of what I do is I sort of think about the past, but past through time. And I've been thinking a lot today about change. And so for thousands of years, humankind, the technology of humankind basically didn't change all that much. Transportation was foot, water, or horse. If you wanted music, you got somebody with an instrument and somebody could sing, and you had to get together and be in one place. It can go on until maybe a couple hundred years ago when science and technology started to change things. And now things change very rapidly, but so much so that I think we sort of accept lots of stuff without even thinking about it. So part of me, and the sort of personal, so my parents were born in Eastern Europe, what's now Ukraine. My father was born in 1898. He was about 50 when I was born. My mother was born in the early 20th century. They grew up in places basically in towns that had not changed since the Middle Ages. And yet they immigrated to the United States and wound up retiring to Florida, not all that far from where rockets went to the moon. And all this sort of modern technology that they had. And I sometimes would think about what was that like to go through that kind of change. Today it's incremental, but it's on the same. It's not that radical a change in one sense or another. We see video projected up here. Fine, of course we do. Yet, one of the very first films that was ever shown was that train coming towards the audience, and maybe it's apocryphal, but supposedly the audience got scared because there was a train coming out of it and ran out of the theater. We don't do that anymore. We accept video. We accept. We can turn on a radio. We can play our whatever kind of equipment we have to listen to sound. We go around with earphones or headphones all the time now. So why is that different than wearing something over your eyes as well? Technology is just simply part of our lives. And what we're talking about now is something that is perhaps changing slightly in a different way than we've been used to, but it is still part of a mixed reality that we are always going through. One of the things that struck me is when the students did that wonderful presentation, so based on Krapp's last tape, and Peter mentioned that, the idea of the tape recorder as actor. And so one of the things that struck me again with this sense of change is, and it also relates to the little discussion that we had with Stuart and Steve about storytelling. So at least in the West, we start with Homer, who sang or talked stories. And for thousands of years, again, stories were told orally. And then we got some kind of writing, and then we got books. And books could hold material. But if you had a book, even if you didn't speak the language, you understood that was a book. You understood that the language in there meant something. And then forms of communication began to change. So with a tape recorder, which is now ancient technology, it was a mechanical thing for the most part. It's a machine. And part of the acting that, of course, happens in Krapp's last tape is there's these reels turning, and we can watch the reels turning and know that on this tape there is sound that is being recreated. So it is fascinating to watch that. But what we had today, quite cleverly, was people putting memory sticks or flash drives or whatever. So I have mine with me here. Do you know what's on here? Of course you don't. I'm not sure that I do either. But what is this? If, 1,000 years from now, some civilization discovers this, they'll have no idea what this is. Maybe they'll think it's some little religious icon. We have reduced our storytelling to things this big that are hidden from us in some way, that require other forms of technology in order to be preserved, to be understood. Apparently at the Smithsonian Institute in the United States, there is at least a person, if not an office, that is devoted to making sure that they have every single generation of computer so that they can read the various disks and other forms, because now, if any of you still have a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk, can you read it? We have no way of doing that. So we have to preserve the technology. With a book, we have to understand the language that it's written in, but the book is there as long as the paper survives in some way. Oral tradition, as long as there is somebody to tell the story, we have a way of preserving that. So these new technologies, I think, are fascinating, but I wonder what happens next year, 10 years from now. One of the things, a word that did not come up today, but I wonder if it should have, is posthuman. There is an incredible amount being written these days about the posthuman. And of course, it has to do with the interaction of humans with technology. We did, somebody, at least one person mentioned human-computer interaction. But now, in some ways, we are becoming partly technological ourselves, almost physiologically. Architects write about the posthuman. All sorts of fields are writing about the posthuman. Is that what we're entering into? That leads me into sort of random jumping around in my mind. One of the things that I've been thinking about, and Sophie mentioned it, is that she said there were all sorts of equipment she'd love to have, but it's too expensive. A lot of what we're talking about today is really accessible to a limited part of the population. And I don't just mean the technology to create it, but to appreciate it, to understand it. Eventually that may change. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever, only a few people could have mobile phones. Now it is such a part of us that we don't even think about it. Something like, I think I had a figure up there, so at least 60% of the world's population have mobile phones. A significant part of the population has personal computers, and so on. It becomes more and more affordable, but with each technological leap, there is that moment when only certain people have access to create, and only certain people have access to take in what has been created. Maybe I will just leave with one sort of other anecdote related to this. One of the avant-garde companies that is most associated with the use of video on stage is the Wooster Group, who did videos on starting with old cathode ray tubes or the little television sets on the stage. What was fascinating about it is that it was bringing in something from outside onto the stage. They were collapsing time and space. They were also giving us perspectives that we could not have normally as an audience. That is developed through another thing we haven't talked about much, the idea of the live video feed, but from other angles. But as the Wooster Group was developing this in the late 70s and 80s and into the 90s, and influencing much of the rest of the world using this, at that point, the technology was still relatively expensive and therefore delicate and valuable. So it was treated almost with a kind of religious quality. A few years later, some people who had been interns with the Wooster Group and created their own avant-garde companies. There were two companies that worked together, Collapsible Giraffe and Radio Hole. And at least one of the pieces I saw of theirs, this is going back, 15 years or maybe 20 years. For them, they grew up with this equipment, and it was also very affordable. And they were doing things like taking a video camera, throwing it across the stage, almost dropping it, catching it. An actor would be acting, then run over and do something on the computer. It was just part of everyday life, and they were playing with it, and they were having a certain kind of fun with it. The Wooster Group didn't have, they had fun, but it was not that sort of enjoyment in the same way. All of this, all I can say is that all of this is changing. It's changing rapidly. And if we have a similar conference to this 5 years from now, this will be old-fashioned technology that we won't even think about. And maybe because none of us will be able to travel anymore due to pandemics, we will all put on our HoloLenses and have our, 300 million people around the world can come to the same conference, but we'll all be seeing it like this. One last anecdote, then I'll put it down. In the late 70s and 80s, or early 80s, I was an editor of a journal called Theater Design and Technology. And at a certain point, the person who had been our graphic designer, did our covers and so on, moved to California, and I was in New York. And so communicating, we could communicate by phone, we could write back and forth, but there was limits to, and I think email was just emerging. There were limits to the communication. And then one day, he said, I've got a way to send you the mock-up for the cover. And at that point, what he's able to do is go to UPS or the Federal Express office or one of those companies, take an image to their office. They were able to fax it. I think most of us didn't have faxes, but they did. They could fax it to their office in New York and then print it out, put it on a truck, come and deliver it to my office. And so within a 24-hour period, we could communicate like that. That, of course, is totally absurd now, but that is how change happens, and so I don't know where this will take us in the future, but it will be an exciting journey to go on. So I'd like to thank everybody who presented today. I learned an incredible amount, and this was a very stimulating morning and afternoon, so thank you all.